Brother Bill's kitchen, and we're going to make some sourdough bread. So the first thing I want to do is refresh the starter. So this is my starter, and you can see it's kind of got a lot of junk falling from it. And it's been in the refrigerator probably several days before I made bread the last time. But I need to refresh it. So what I'm gonna do, and this might seem crazy, is I'm gonna throw out almost all of this. Also, I'll talk to you about how to make starter in another video, but this is the starter that's already made. So I'm gonna take my starter and I'm gonna dump out pretty much everything. So I know it seems like a waste, but the reason why I'm dumping out pretty much everything is because I'm going to refresh this with new flour and some water, and that's going to give a lot of food for this yeast in here. So basically you can see that I've scraped out everything except just basically what's hanging to the sides here. Just maybe a tablespoon or a little more. And now I'm gonna come here to refresh this. And so this is a gram scale. It's something you definitely need to do. And I'm gonna put that spoon in there and zero this out. And now I'm going to put some flour and water equal amounts by weight. So this is, I'm going to zero that out again. And you can use any kind of flour, it doesn't matter. This is bread flour. I could use all-purpose flour, which is what's in here. I could use whole wheat flour. That actually make it even a little bit more rigorous. And so I'm going to put in $150 grams of flour. I'll put a little bit of all-purpose in too. Doesn't matter. $140, a little more. That's good enough. Not rocket science. Don't overthink it. I'm going to zero it again, and I'm going to put, it was 148, so I'm going to put about the same amount of water. It doesn't matter what kind of water. I'm using bottled water. You can use tap water. It works just as well. And it's room temperature. And 144, 146, close enough. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix this up really good. And it's 10 o'clock at night right now. I'm doing this because tomorrow morning I'm gonna bake my bread. Okay, now that I mixed the new flour and water together, I'm just gonna cover this kind of loosely. I'm just gonna leave it here on the counter overnight, and we'll look at it in the morning. Okay, so we made our leaven last night. That's the refreshed starter, and this is the height it was at. And you can see now how active this is. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna make one loaf of bread, and that's gonna have in total 500 grams of flour and 350 grams of water. And so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the 350 grams of water. This is just tap water, it's room temperature. And I'm not going to put it all. I'll put 325 and then save 25, 324, and I'll put another 25 in later. And then I'm going to put some of this starter, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 100 grams. So I'm going to zero this scale again and put 100 grams. Now you watch this, it's going to float. If you see that, see how it floats? This means it's really active. So I'm going to put 100 grams of starter. you know, if you have a little more or less, it's not a big deal. I think one mistake a lot of people might make when they're doing something like this is just overthinking it. So don't overthink it. Bread is fairly forgiving. You want to get the kind of percentages right of flour and water and starter generally, but if you're a little off, it's okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just mix this up a little bit in the water and just dissolve it a little bit. And now I'm gonna add some flour. Now I could add any kind of flour, unbleached flour. It could be whole wheat flour, it could be all-purpose flour, or bread flour. Now bread flour and whole wheat flour have a higher protein content. So this whole wheat has 14%, and bread, this particular bread flour I have is also 14%. And I'm just gonna make this with all bread flour. I really like this flour, it's artisan bread flour. And so I'm gonna zero the scale again, and I'm gonna put 500 grams of flour in here. Perfect. And now I'm going to just mix this together until there's not any dry bits left. So doesn't matter if there's a couple of little bits of dry bit, because we're going to be mixing this a lot over the next couple of hours. So just basically making like a shaggy ball like that, and can scrape some of this stuff back in. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it. I'm going to let it auto lease about maybe between 30 minutes and an hour, and that's to develop gluten. After that, I'm going to add the other 25 grams of water and the salt and mix it up again. So it's been auto leasing about 45 minutes, and you can see in here how it looks. And so right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the salt, which is going to be 10 grams, and the other 25 grams of water. So this is again just room temperature tap water. You can use any kind of water you want. Some people say don't use tap water, but I've found that really doesn't matter unless you have really bad tap water. I'm going to put a little bit more water in here. Okay, that's a little more than I need, but that's okay, it doesn't matter. Now I'm gonna put 10 grams of salt. I don't want too much salt, but that's 6. All right, there's 10. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna kind of mix this up. This salt I'm using is sea salt from El Salvador that a friend of ours brings us. It's really good salt, but you could use any kind of salt you want. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in this salt mixture here. And now what I want to do is I really want to squeeze this, and I'm also going to use the dough scraper like this. I want to really incorporate it this time. So I want to make sure there's no dry bits at all. So I'm just going to really squeeze it. And I'm going to use this dough scraper to scrape off anything that's on those sides. But that will come off as I do this. And so you can already see some bubbles are starting to form in the dough. Now I'm gonna cover it and I'm gonna leave it again for another 30 minutes. Okay, so I let this rest for about, I don't know, it was a little bit more than a half an hour. Like I said, don't overthink it. I was busy, so I didn't have time to come back to it, but you can see how the texture is already changing in this. And now we're gonna do what's called a turn or a fold for the next maybe 2 hours. one every 30 minutes. But the first one I'm going to do is going to be much more rigorous. So basically, what I'm going to do is dip my hand in a little bit of water, and I'm just going to, a fold means I'm taking what's underneath and moving it on top from this one side. And then from the other side, and then I'm rotating the bowl from the other side, and then from the other side. Now you can see it's still like kind of like stuck to the bowl. So what I like to do the first time I do it is just really just do this a lot more rigorously the first time. So what I'm doing is I'm just scraping this up, and now kind of, and I use my hand as like a dough hook. So if you look in from the top, let me just show you what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to do this basically much more rigorously. I'm just going to move it around. This is kind of like kneading it. So it's basically what I'm going to do is kind of maybe knead it for about 5 minutes the first time. Then after that, I'm going to do much more gentle folds. So this first time you do this, you can be pretty rigorous, and you could squeeze it a little bit. But basically what I'm doing is I'm just kind of like using my hand as like a dough hook. And you can see, and then I'll switch directions a little bit. You can see that some of that stuff on the sides is kind of like coming off now, and it's starting to look a lot smoother. So I'm just going to do that a little bit. Maybe that's enough. And here, I'm just going to wet this scraper and just kind of scrape some of the stuff down in. And if you look here, it's actually now starting to get kind of like a nice little shape to it. And so what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to do one fold every 30 minutes for about the next 2 hours. So to make a turn, you take a hand, wet hand, stick it underneath the dough, pull it up from one side, pull it over. Then underneath the dough again, from the other side, pull it over. Turn the bowl on the other side, not hard, just gentle. On the other side. So basically what you're doing is stretching the dough up and over on itself. Okay, so I've been making turns on this for the last 2 hours, and I think I'm going to just do one more. I probably don't need to, but just so you can kind of see how much it's increased in volume. But I'll just do one really soft last turn, and then we're just going to let it bulk ferment, and that usually is about 2 hours. And it probably is not going to need that much because it's already increased a lot in size. So I'm going to just do one last turn here, and you can see a lot of the gluten starting to develop already. And then this, now I'm not going to do any more of these turns. You can already see some of the air bubbles forming. This has got a lot of air already, and we're going to just let this bulk ferment probably maybe a couple of hours, but you have to watch it. So until it's doubled in volume, and that's going to be, it looks like with this one, pretty soon. Okay, so the bulk fermentation is done, and if you look here, you can see it's increased a lot in volume. There's holes, it's got air, and the whole process from beginning to end should take about 6 hours, but you don't need to overthink it because I was busy today. I had meetings, and I didn't just do every 30 minutes like I said I was going to do. I mean, sometimes I forgot about it. I'd come back, do a turn. You know, you just have to kind of watch the dough, and you do turns when you can for a couple of hours, and then you just leave it alone, and then it'll come out like this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape it out on an unfloured surface, and this looks good, actually, really good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sprinkle it with just like a little bit of flour. So I'm going to put some flour down here because I might need it to flour my hands. But I'm just going to sprinkle this with a little bit of flour. And the reason why I'm sprinkling with a little bit of flour is what I'm trying to do is form this into a ball with my bench knife. And I don't want it to stick to the bench knife, but I don't want to put too much flour either. So what you're going to do is just kind of like move it around like this with the bench knife. And then what I want to do is kind of form it into a somewhat of a tight ball. And the way you do that is, I need a little bit more flour on here, is you take it and you just kind of slide it like that. Bring it around, and now take the bench knife, slide it. See, now this is forming tension. Now slide it. You can see how it's turning into a nice kind of smooth ball. I don't want to do this too much, but I just want to get it to the point where I have a nice round smooth ball, and it looks like it's just about there, and I think that's good enough. And now what I'm going to do is just sprinkle the top of it with a little bit of flour, not much. So at this point you don't want a lot of flour. There's bubbles here, and you can see this is very full of air. The flour is just so the plastic doesn't stick to it. So I'm going to cover it with plastic. And the reason why you want to do that is you don't want like some sort of like skin to form on the outside, like a hard skin from the air. And I'm going to leave that for 30 minutes, and then we're going to do the final shaping and put it into the banneton. Been resting probably a little more than half an hour because I was busy doing something else. Like I said, don't overthink it. And in this bowl, I have a mixture of rice flour and all-purpose flour. And I'm going to use this to flour the banneton. Now, the banneton, don't be afraid to over-flour the banneton because you can always brush the flour off the loaf. So you want to have a lot of flour in this so it doesn't stick to the sides of the banneton or the bottom. So I'm just like really flouring this pretty liberally. Later when we cook it, you'll see how I get it off the out of the basket. And so I forgot to tell you the reason why we didn't flour the counter before was because you wanted tension when you made it into a ball. But now it's like flattened out, you can see. And this was the side I had flour on. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit more flour on that because I'm going to flip this over. And when I flip it over, then I don't want that side to stick. So now what I'm going to do is flour my hands a little bit, and I'm going to do the final shaping. I'm just going to pull it out like this, shape it like you would folding a letter or an envelope, and then do the same thing. Keep your hands floured from the other side. Now it looks like a mess, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pulling from the edges into the middle. You don't want to do this too hard because you don't want to degas the dough too much. But can you see how I'm kind of like creating tension on the outside and it's starting to look like a nice ball? And you just kind of grab where you can and pull it up all into the middle until you have this pretty nice tight ball. Now I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to put a little bit of flour on the top. At this point, it doesn't really matter if you put a lot of flour or not because that's going to be the outside of the loaf. And I don't want flour here. What I'm going to do is try to make this into a tight ball by rolling it like this and kind of dragging it a little bit. And you kind of like drag it around in a circle a little bit. Roll, drag, like this. And there I have my nice loaf. I'm going to put it in the banneton like this. And now one last thing, I'm going to just put a little bit of flour around the edges here because as this thing proofs, it's going to proof overnight in the refrigerator, then this is going to grow out to the sides. And put a little bit on top. And then I don't want it to stick to the side of the banneton. So now that that's done, I'm just going to cover it up. And I'm going to stick it in the refrigerator and put it there overnight. And tomorrow we will bake our bread. Okay, so this has been proofing in the refrigerator overnight. You can see it's really increased also in volume. And I have some parchment paper here. And what I'm going to do is spray a little bit of oil on the parchment paper. And I'm going to dump this banneton out onto the parchment paper like this. And there's my bread. You can see it's got a nice structure. I have my Dutch oven heating up at 500 degrees. It's been in there for maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes, half hour. And I'm gonna take this, it's a serrated knife, you can use a razor blade. I'm just gonna score it, just making some light cuts like this. And that is so that it opens up nice and doesn't burst. I'm gonna put this in here And then I'm gonna cover it. I'm gonna cook this for 30 minutes covered. Okay, so it's been cooking for 30 minutes. After 15 minutes, I lowered the oven to 450 degrees. And now's the fun part. Let's take a look and see what this looks like. I have a little tray. I'm gonna put it on here so you can see when I open it up, and I'm gonna put it back in with the tray so that helps so it doesn't burn on the bottom. So let's take a look. Hopefully it grows nice and high and you can see it. Yep, looks great. Now it's a little pale. Now what I'm gonna do is put it back in the oven. And I'm gonna cook it for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll check it after about 10 minutes till it's nice and brown. So it's been cooking for 20 minutes and 15 minutes, sorry. And you can see it's looking nice and brown, and it's even blackening up on the top a little bit. Now I'm gonna take the bread out of the oven. And I'm just gonna take it out of here and put it onto a rack to cool. And there's the finished loaf.